In this video, we're going to cover the idea of subsidies. Now, I didn't cover subsidies in class because the analysis is essentially identical to a tax, and you'll kind of see as we work through it. Okay. So let's dive in with subsidies. Right? A subsidy, all it is a payment from government. Now, it can either go to the buyer or the seller, and it's usually targeted for a particular good or service. Okay, and again, the idea is to incentivize buyers or sellers to engage in a particular action. Okay, so examples of this would be basically scholarships. Now, a subsidy is going to be for government, so private scholarships wouldn't count as a subsidy, but Pell Grants and things like that, money that comes from the government for education for a particular student, would be considered a subsidy. Right? A lot of states now give subsidies for the installation of solar panels. That is, essentially, you are giving the buyer of solar panels money if they buy solar panels. Same thing with a lot of states with electric vehicles. Florida doesn't really do it, but Georgia does. Right? So if you buy an electric vehicle in Georgia, they give you a bunch of money. Right? So this is the idea with subsidies. They're also used a lot in agricultural markets, so farmers get a lot of subsidies, etc. Okay. And again, the idea is you're trying to encourage a particular activity, right? You're subsidizing solar panels, or you're subsidizing electric cars, or you're subsidizing the growing of corn because you're trying to get more of it, right? So if people levy taxes on cigarettes and so forth to try to get less of it, right? Subsidies are kind of the opposite. You're levying subsidies, or you're giving subsidies so that you can try to get more of a particular activity. Okay. Okay, so an example of a subsidy for a buyer would be, right? So examples of this would be solar panels. So if you install solar panels on your home, you're the buyer of solar panels, you would essentially get the subsidy. So that would be a subsidy for buyers, right? Another example would be electric vehicles. Okay, so for example, in Georgia and California, if you buy or lease an electric vehicle, right, you get subsidies. Sometimes it's in the form of tax breaks, but essentially it's a way of the government giving you money for buying electric vehicles. Okay, so an example of subsidies for sellers, right, is ag subsidies. This is probably the most common. In fact, probably most subsidies given by the U.S. government are for agriculture, right? And this is essentially where you pay farmers to grow a certain crop. Right? Probably the most famous agricultural subsidy is ethanol subsidies, or essentially subsidies that go to corn farmers, right? So example of this would be corn farmers. There are a lot of subsidies for that because the idea was a while back we could use corn to produce ethanol because the idea was that was better for the environment. Now we kind of have a better understanding and it's not so good for the environment. But you'll have a short video on that for your video quiz. Where we kind of learn, yeah, not such a good idea, but that's the way it works sometimes. Okay, so subsidies for buyers. This is essentially you give buyers the money when they buy solar panels or electric vehicles. When sellers get subsidies, they're getting the subsidy to produce something, so the money's going straight to the sellers. Okay. Okay, so let's work through an example. The graphs will be a lot like the ones we did in class, but the example we'll do will be for electric vehicles. Okay. And we're going to keep it simple so we don't have to do the car purchase. We're going to assume the car is leased, okay? So we're going to have a monthly payment. I think I have the payment set at $300 a month, right? And we're going to do the analysis of what would happen if, right, say the federal government or a state decided to subsidize electric cars for buyers, okay? So the idea is, again, they're going to lease. So someone who leases an electric vehicle will get $225 a month toward their lease for the vehicle. Okay? All right, so let's graph this. Again, start with our regular axes. Make sure you label quantity down here and price up here. Okay? And go ahead, right? This is going to be our market for electric cars. Okay? So go ahead and draw in the usual supply and demand diagrams, or I should say the supply and demand curves. Okay? So go ahead and draw in your demand curve like so. Label it with a D. And then go ahead and draw in your supply curve. Oh, something around like this. Go ahead and label it with an S. And this is the supply of electric vehicles. Okay? So again, the demand curve over here represents the buyers, or the people who are leasing electric vehicles. And the S represents the companies that are making and selling electric vehicles. Okay? So, as usual, we're going to have an equilibrium price and quantity in the market before anything happens. So go ahead and draw that in. We have P star. And draw down here, and you're going to have Q star. Okay? So this is essentially the market before we put in the subsidy. Okay? And I think on the next slide I have this set at roughly around $300 a month for the lease for, say, a Nissan Leaf or one of those types of electric vehicles. Okay? All right, so now before we go to the next slide, the question is, this is a subsidy, so money's being given to the buyers, right? If we go back to our example, the buyers are going to get the $225, okay? So the question is, which curve do we shift, right? Again, it's just like taxes, right? You shift the curve of the person who either is, in the case of subsidies, getting the money. In taxes, it would be in the case of the person having to pay the tax. So because the buyer is getting the subsidy, we're going to shift the demand curve, because the demand curve represents the wishes of the buyers, right? So, okay, demand curve is going to shift. Which way? Well, if the buyers are getting money, it's as if they've got an increase in income, and we know an increase in income will shift demand curves out to the right. So we know our demand curve is going to shift to the right, okay? So let's go to the next slide here where I've essentially already drawn. How did I do? Oh, that was pretty close. Well done. I'll pat myself on the back. Anyway, moving on. Okay, now, when we're doing a question on subsidies, right, I would again have to give you a legend or something that indicates the size of the subsidy, okay? So I've got it written in here. The buyer gets the subsidy, so we're going to shift that demand curve vertically by the size of the subsidy, okay? So get a ruler, and I'm going to grab this guy and see if I can move it around to show you, right? What I've done is, right, the distance between that line and that dot is the size of the subsidy. Same over here, the distance between the line and the dot is the size of the subsidy, right? So I went ahead and made two dots, and then I'm going to take my ruler and draw in my new demand curve. This is my subsidized demand curve, okay? You can put D2 or you can put D sub S for the subsidy, and this is our initial demand curve, okay? So this is how the subsidy affects the market for electric vehicles, okay? Well, we know we're going to have a new equilibrium, so go ahead and draw that in. Okay, and draw this in down here. Okay, so this is our new price, or the price the buyer pays. Okay, and we know we're going to have a new quantity. Okay, and we can go ahead, put in a little line here. We'll talk about the significance of this line on the next slide. Right? And this we'll call P, and we can do net, let's say. Okay, so the size of this subsidy is the same as over here, right? Again, if I drag this over here, right, notice how the distance between there and there is the size of the subsidy, okay? So that means the new price is here at a higher price, right? But the fact that buyers get this difference from here Actually, I'll just move this over here. Right, from here to here, this is the size of the subsidy that the buyers get, okay? All right, so this is size of subsidy. All right, so again, this is a lot like the analysis with taxes, except now we're shifting the curves up, right, showing an increase in demand, okay? All right, so the next slide has this all drawn out nice and neat, size of subsidy, and the higher price put here, okay? So this is the price the buyer pays now, right? This price down here is we'll call the net price, and this is the old equilibrium price. So you might be thinking, okay, so the price was $300, the buyer is going to get $225, so after it's all said and done, the net price should only be 75 bucks, 300 minus 225. But as you notice here, it's not. Right? And again, the same thing is coming into play here. Buyers and sellers will share a subsidy, right? So the buyer doesn't get to gain all of that subsidy, right? He shares it with the seller, and we can see it here on this diagram, right? The difference between here and here is not the size of the subsidy. This whole distance is the size of the subsidy. So subsidies, even though the buyer gets them, end up helping both the buyer and the seller. Okay? So just like with taxes, both of them share in it. Right? Okay. So as you can see, this analysis is pretty similar to with taxes. Right? So it's similar to a tax. However, the one difference is instead of taking money, the government is providing or giving money. Right? So the follow-up question is, what consequence of a tax doesn't apply to a subsidy? Right? Everything else we've done with subsidies is similar to with taxes, except for one thing. Right? On our diagram, there was no deadweight loss. There was no deadweight loss. Okay? Again, there's a lot of times abbreviated with DWL, right? Because we're giving a subsidy, we're not reducing the number of transactions that can take place, we're increasing them, right? So we can't see the deadweight loss in this market because we don't have a reduction in those transactions. However, it's not as if there is no deadweight loss because the money that the government needs to provide the subsidy had to be taxed somewhere else, right? So it came from your income taxes, and so the deadweight loss is over in that market and not in this market where there's the subsidy, okay? So the deadweight loss is kind of hidden in this analysis of a subsidy. Okay, so wrapping up, again, subsidies, just like taxes, both the buyer and the seller end up being subsidized by the government in the market for electric cars, or whether it's agricultural subsidies, or whether it's solar panels, or any of the things that get subsidized by the government, right? Subsidy is the opposite of a tax, and so both buyer and seller gain again. All right, and that's it.